Today's webcast is Safety in Numbers, the Value of Crowdsourced Threat Intelligence, sponsored by Alient. My name is Benjamin White with the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating this webcast. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackelford from Voodoo Security and SANS, and Jaime Blasco, Vulnerability Research Team Lead for Alient. Before I hand things over to the presenters, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webcast. Please feel free to enter any questions you have for our presenters into the chat window at any time. At this point, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our featured speaker, Dave Shackelford.
Hey everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great webcast for you, and we're excited to be here. And this topic is certainly one that's very timely right now in the security industry, and I've had the distinct pleasure to present with the folks from Alient Vault several times now, as they're doing quite a bit of work in this space, really looking to advance the state of threat intelligence across the entirety of the community, which is definitely something that's needed. And so in this webcast, what we're going to do is really kind of walk through just different aspects of a threat intelligence program, taking a look at some of the internal aspects, as well as some of the different types of external services and attributes that you would likely want to take into account, and then really also investigate how more organizations are really starting to move towards building a more mature overall threat intelligence program in general. So with that said, let me go ahead and move us on. And so, this is kind of the opening statement du jour, if there was one, which really kind of gets down to what most of the targeted organizations out there are seeing today. And this is just a very, very high-level overview. In fact, now it's actually kind of funny. Just in the last couple of hours, I've seen quite a bit of flurry of activity going on in the security industry about the classic December predictions for security for the next year. And across the spectrum of those predictions are a lot that are related to kind of advanced threats and certainly malware that ties into the advanced threat landscape. And so organizations that are being aggressively targeted, and that's quite a few these days, and we know this, are starting to see some really specific types of activities that we definitely haven't seen in the past, right? We're seeing more aggressive pursuit of very specific targets. So in other words, the attackers know what they're after. We see a lot of social engineering, so people are definitely very high-profile targets. In fact, that's one of the most common ways that attackers are getting to the kinds of data and the kinds of things within organizations that they're after. We're seeing persistence across the organization. And while I'm sure everybody in the entire security industry is probably sick of the term APT, by this point, there's something to that, obviously. I mean, you do see organizations struggling to eradicate these threats and not even realizing that they've got them, in fact, for some significant length of time in quite a few different types of breach scenarios. We have escalation of privileges. We have basically targets that are adapting and changing over time as attackers move around within networks. And ultimately, we're seeing the extraction of data in really new and very innovative ways. In fact, it's gotten much more difficult for a lot of organizations to really pinpoint data exfiltration as it's really happening right under their nose, especially when you deal with things like DNS traffic or encrypted traffic that typically hasn't really gotten a lot of attention, and now all of a sudden is passing data out without without people even knowing. So a lot of things happening in this space, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so again, if you go and look at these predictions that are starting to fly for next year, people are really throwing out some crazy stuff that's happening across the landscape, and I would expect that to continue. So moving us along here, this is one of the big questions. Oh, let me go back up here. This is one of the big questions that a lot of people are looking at, specifically around threat intelligence programs. And this, of course, comes from the Verizon DBIR report that came out this year. And I've actually had a lot of really fascinating conversations with SANS students in class and also consulting clients. And I'm sure the folks over at Alient Vault are probably really dealing with this as well, seeing a lot of activity. And Jaime, I'd be interested in just getting your opinion here as far as really whether you think this is accurate or not. This is really one of the big topics of debate that I hear, is that we're seeing this kind of classic spectrum of geographic threat location and source locations, but at the same time, there's a lot of suspicion that those don't necessarily tell the whole story. In fact, a lot of times, just because a geographic location is the source, that only means that there are compromised systems within those geographic locations that the attackers are using from elsewhere. And one big one that I've heard come up numerous times that isn't even listed on here is actually some of the African countries down in Nigeria and other places where there's really powerful infrastructure being built and very cheap bandwidth, and attackers are setting up shop there and doing a lot more than just the classic types of fraud activity. And so, Jaime, I don't know if you've got opinions on this, or if this kind of accurately reflects what you're seeing, but do you have some thoughts there?
Yes, you said we are seeing the same activity and we generate similar graphs. But the point about this is, the fact why China is always the first country there is basically because it's a question of quantity of IP addresses that you can find in China. It's probably one of the countries with more IP addresses assigned to that country. And on the other hand, as you said, a lot of groups and attackers are actually compromising systems on those countries that, as you can expect, China, Romania, and Bulgaria, and some other countries, you can find hundreds of thousands of systems that you can compromise very easily. So that's the main reason why we are seeing this graph. But as we are talking about threat intelligence, using the source of an intrusion attempt or the country of that attack by itself is not a good indicator of malicious activity, as we will see later when we discuss the different AOCs that we can use.
Excellent point, actually. Yeah, that's very true. And so this is one of the things that people really tend to kind of hyper-focus on, but in fact, as Jaime just said, may not really be the biggest indicators, right? This actually may be just one finite data point that needs to be correlated along with quite a few others. So that said, let's keep going along here throughout the presentation. Now, this is one that fascinates me, and I bring this one up, and I don't like to throw stones, but this particular graph that came from TrustWave's Global Security Report has met with a huge amount of criticism from a lot of the clients and organizations that I've worked with and continue to work with, because many just feel that it's not very accurate whatsoever. In fact, based on the kinds of threats that they're seeing, this really is almost completely off the grid for a lot of the types of things that they're usually experiencing, particularly for advanced threats that are taking advantage of network-based vulnerabilities. And so certainly, I think we could expect to see different types of password-based issues, kind of happening out there, or, certainly seeing, some of these different types of, maybe ARP cache poisoning for things internally, although that's becoming a lot less common. But some of these things really just don't reflect the threat landscape today, and there's a reason that I included this slide in the presentation, and that's to illustrate the fact that the landscape for threat intelligence for many organizations is very, very, very muddy. If you take your average company or your average agency or your average, just university, whatever, out there and say, well, where are you trying to develop your general idea of what's happening in the world of information security? Completely aside from indicators that you gather, what kind of trends are you looking at and where are you getting them? Quite a few will reference these, half dozen or maybe dozen well-known industry reports that are published. And when you put these things out there and then realize from talking to some more mature organizations that are really working to put together more sophisticated threat intelligence functions, and they come straight to you and say, not really accurate at all, this doesn't even reflect what's going on in the landscape, it really calls into question what we're doing and maybe kind of causes us to revisit the whole idea of threat intelligence as a whole. And so that's why I included this, just to really illustrate, kind of the casting of doubt on the way we've traditionally been handling this, and where a lot of people tend to get those kinds of general, trends and things. So the next thing that starting to get a little bit more tactical when you're talking about different types of threat intelligence indicators and really what those mean, there's a number of different levels that organizations have to kind of put together and really start thinking through. And the way that we usually break these down, and this is kind of the classic model, if you will, is in atomic, computed, and behavioral. And so atomic indicators really can't be broken down any further. So if you gather indicators like source addresses, right? So going back to the geographic locations, if you have a source IP address, then it's a source IP address. It's what it is. And so you take that for what it is. Same thing with things like email addresses. If you're bringing in data like vulnerability IDs or CVE numbers and things, those are very base in nature. And so you kind of feed that into whatever your intelligence program is, as is. Computed indicators require some work. And so examples of this would be things like regular expression matches where you've built very particular pattern structures, or things like hash values for files where you're going to go consult some well-known industry database or verify against some known malware repository, for example, to find that an executable is in fact a malicious file versus a normal Windows file, for example. So the computed takes kind of one piece and then has to do some work in order to ultimately reach the end indicator that has value for the threat intelligence program. Behavioral indicators can really be some general hybrid of both atomic and computed indicators, but really the way I tend to think of behavioral, and I think a lot of threat intel teams and also security and analyzing teams put together these types of indicators around more correlation factors. So this is where you've got your traditional maybe SOC team or group working with a SIEM product that's taking in a lot of different data and then telling a story with that data. So there's a behavior, there's some specific type of workflow associated with the indicators that potentially, again, tells a better and bigger story there. So behavioral indicators tend to have quite a bit of value, but the key thing for a behavioral indicator to really have value is that it has to be composed of either atomic and or computed indicators that are accurately developed in the first place. And so that's, of course, still a very big challenge for a lot of the organizations out there, is just getting that idea of what has value and how to use it most appropriately. Another thing that we're seeing, kind of going all the way back to that beginning slide, just talking about advanced threats, is that we're seeing more campaign-based, kind of targeted assessment from the attacking side. So these guys are building much longer-term, very project-oriented almost types of campaigns where they're trying to focus on very specific targets over time, or they have a plan to attack a person or a group of people and use that as a stepping stone to secondary tier targets. But there's a longer period of time involved, and again, usually there's some sort of larger scale plan. Gathering intelligence across campaign targets where you see these longer term pictures kind of developing can really help build and grow an intelligence program as well. And this can help you build better defenses. So really what that comes down to is realizing that you're not dealing with kind of quick hit attacks anymore, especially with advanced attackers. They're not coming in, taking data, leaving. They're building much bigger strategic types of attack campaigns, and you can learn from those. And the key thing to understand about that is that it's both good and bad. It's bad in the sense that they're obviously planning and plotting and doing more against you, but at the same time, your window of opportunity to discover that things are happening and then really learn from what those occurrences are, building more and better defenses, can really improve as well. And so, again, getting into the concept of campaigns naturally leads us to the sorts of indicators that you would want to look for throughout the entire life cycle or construct of one of those campaigns. And so these are just some examples of indicators. And so I kind of threw these together as some of the general ones that I had seen. And I know Jaime certainly has quite a few that the Alient team has seen and has really recognized for having some additional value. And so while you're looking at a lot of these, and they fall pretty squarely into that computed and atomic set of categories. Jaime, what other ones are you guys really seeing here that kind of stand out and tend to be more valuable across the landscape today. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so as you said, I mean, the main goal of an IOC is basically generating a piece of information that can be used to search or identify potential compromised systems on your enterprise. So basically, you can use any single piece of information that can lead you to find one of these compromised systems. Here is the list of the most used indicators of compromise, and this list is like this is because usually you want to maintain it simple. So basically, you want fast access to actionable security information. So if you are starting with your threat intelligence program, I recommend to start with the basic IOCs that you can easily implement in your organization, and then continue generating more complex IOCs and integrating those in your security policies and your security detection and prevention capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And so I think it's an important point to focus, not on just these kind of generic lists of indicators, but also to understand that this is also subjective too, right? So every organization is going to find different levels of value within different types of indicators depending on their particular threat landscape. And so, this is actually some additional sets of indicators with different standards and some other different types of rule sets that, again, Jaime, I know you guys have really got a lot of experience with and have found differing experiences, for different clients that you guys have. What are your thoughts on some of these different standards and types of IOCs out there?
Yeah. So the main problem is, as we saw in the previous slide, with all those indicators, the problem is that you don't have context on those indicators. So 10 years ago, we used to use IOCs in terms of a PDF file with a list of IP addresses. Then you got that information, you put that information into your network devices. But in the end, when you were dealing with an incident involving one of those IP addresses, you didn't remember where that information came from, which was the actor that was attacking the system where you collected that piece of information. So the problem with IOCs and with threat intelligence in general is all about context. It's all about, okay, I have this IOC that is an IP address, but that's not enough. You need to have context about who is the actor using that IP address. Is that IP address an scanning host? Is that IP address as a command and control server? Is that IP address sending exploits against network devices? So it's all about context. So then we have to talk about standards that you can use to embed indicators of compromise and also describe metadata and context about those indicators of compromise. The problem right now is that there is no generally accepted standard data format for security teams to share indicators of compromise. But several standards have arisen in the last few years. So for instance, we have OpenIOC that is very specific to describing campaigns and describing technical indicators of compromise both in network and both network and host basis. But OpenIOC is most host basis. So basically everything related to payloads, everything related with registry entries, with files that are created by payloads or exploits. Then we have Cybox, IODEF, and the new kind of new sticks format that are more complete. So basically, you can describe any technical indicator of compromise, and then you can embed context. So for instance, on sticks, you can embed JARA rules, you can embed SNOR rules, and other kind of actionable indicators of compromise. On the other hand, I also love using what I call do-it-yourself IOCs. That is basically IOCs that are ready to use in open source software. So the good thing about this is that you can process the data and easily integrate it in your system. Sometimes even if your security vendor doesn't support the standard. So this is especially interesting when you are running open source software that you can adapt to your needs. So that this is a very specific case. Is a Snore that is the most used network IDS. It's an open source one. So basically, if you are able to find IOCs in a Snore format, you just have to download a Snore and you can start using these IOCs. That's why I call it do-it-yourself, ready-to-use IOCs.
Yeah, I like that term. Do it yourself. They're not off-the-shelf IOCs. So, yeah, cool. So, I mean, again, this is one of the real areas of focus for most organizations today. Is not only recognizing that we have longer-term, kind of bigger-scale attack scenarios going on, but really also recognizing that we've really got to get better at identifying the attributes of the attacks that we can build and learn from. And I know there's been a lot of focus on this in the forensics community, like you said, Jaime, especially with OpenIFC at the host level, trying to build, better indicators and better significant identification data points across hosts. But the problem is that that's only one place, that's only one location, and we've got to do a much better job at gathering network-based data at the same time so that we can start putting that all together. And so this is just one example of an attack cycle that, I think it's a fairly reasonable one, and I think most people would agree we've seen this cycle kind of repetitively over the last several years with different threat actors doing some intelligence gathering activities. Certainly the open source intelligence gathering type of focus for attackers and social engineering focus has led to the point of entry very often being some end users, and certainly with the RSA breach and other big kind of high profile ones we saw that. But what these guys are doing is spending longer amounts of time building their own kind of stealthy command and control infrastructure internally, and then slowly exfiltrating the data. And so what you're looking at here are essentially a lot of finite, specific elements within the context of a campaign. And I think that's the key way to approach this when you're looking at building a threat intel program, is looking at each one of these stages and asking yourself, what kinds of threat intel data, what kinds of indicators can I actually build and develop at each stage? And so, for example, during the intelligence gathering phase, what kind of intelligence gathering could you do? And just to give an example of this, I actually had one client that I thought had this great idea. Now, granted, this wouldn't be for everybody, but they actually went and they put together an entirely fictitious executive within their organization and posted it to their website and built a social media profile and basically built this entire fake person. They called it a honey person, and they built very, very finite triggers for every bit of interested data, or interested querying that came across this person. And so they would treat that as a somewhat elevated area of interest. And certainly there was a lot that they had to wade through. I mean, they got everything from, spammers to, just general kind of sales and marketing activity. But they did find some really interesting early stage indicators specifically gathered around a supposed high-profile and high-value target by trying to target that early stage of the attack cycle, by building something in within the intelligence gathering phase, and it helped them start focusing on the other indicators that went along with that, like source IP addresses, like kind of repeated patterns of behavioral activity and how those came in and so forth. So I think that's really the focus. When you look at an attack cycle, it's easy to just dismiss these and go, oh yeah, we've seen these in 276 marketing presentations this year. But at the same time, ask yourself how you're approaching building out this type of attack cycle focus in your own threat intel program, and what you can try to gather at each different stage along that program. And so I'll hand it back over to you, Jaime, because I know you've got some really kind of cool stuff you guys have been working on within the Alien Vault product set that addresses some of this.
Yes, as Dave said, that this is one of the most important things that you have to do as in your threat intelligence program, that is basically identifying the different stages of the attacks that are happening and the attacks that are going to happen in the future, and basically trying to build IOCs or to obtain IOCs for each of those states. So basically, one of the most common use frameworks for those attack cycles is called the kill chain, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this one. So basically, it gives you information about the different levels and cycles of attacks, and how to prevent, how to help both detecting and preventing attackers to operate on all the different levels. So basically, we have integrated that kill chain framework, at least the taxonomy and the strategies and the intents of the attackers in each of the events and the alarms that are being generated in our system, and we are able to classify the stages of different attacks. So this is very valuable for two reasons. The first one is because if you have 3 operators running your security infrastructure and they don't have enough time to deal with all the incidents that they have to fix and they have to detect, with this screen and you can basically detect attackers in different stages that are compromising your system. So basically, if you detect activity on the system compromised axis, you'll probably go there first, because you know that stage is one of the latest ones, and you really want to detect what's going on in that alarm, because it's indicating that some of the actors could have probably compromised their systems and are ready to exfiltrate data. And then, of course, you have attackers trying to perform probing of your networks to obtain data about your infrastructures to launch future attacks. You have attackers performing actual attacks and delivering payloads that probably a good percentage of them are being blocked by your preventing technologies. And then you have exploitation and installation, that is basically when that attacks are being successful and your IOCs or your including IDS events, including log events, are indicating that the attack was successful and the actors are ready to exploit and install payloads in your systems.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And I like that kind of kill chain flow that you guys have put together there, because I do think a lot more people are familiar with that. And while, granted, that kill chain specific flow doesn't necessarily work as is for everyone, it's close enough to where people can really build categorization of the different stages and kind of work from that. And having kind of been around and seen what people have been doing, I think that's a big leg up from where we have been, candidly, in terms of starting to advance the state of internal threat intel programs. So the other thing, too, is looking at the sources, and that, of course, is one of the real reasons for this webcast, is kind of investigating those. This is like a short list, obviously. So you've got a number of these commercial services cropping up. Certainly a lot of the traditional vendors have kind of started offering these. A whole new spate of vendors has really started offering these. The problem, though, is that there's just not any maturity to speak of here in terms of really knowing how well they're performing. So we don't know which ones are really good versus really bad. We haven't seen any Gartner quadrants around anything like this quite yet. So this is an area that I think is very much in its infancy as a security vendor area. Building in-house threat intel, that's usually incident response teams, SOC operators, forensics teams, vertical communities. So if you're within, say, the financial sector, going and meeting with the financials, ISACs, for example, and sharing data there, or working with InfraGard and some of those types of groups. Yeah, there's definitely some value there, but the question is, where else can we go, right? I mean, even with all of those sources, a lot of people still say, I just don't feel like I've got enough, and so I think that introduces the opportunity for more of a crowdsourced model, and that's what we're really going to get to here in just one second. Because again, we've got to start leveraging the wisdom of crowds and figuring out what other people have seen and what they're doing. Just kind of looking at what this is leading to. This is actually from a Forrester report that kind of asked what people have done. I mean, looking at all these attacks that people have experienced over the past 5 years or so, what are the actual results of that? What have people actually done about it? And so realize this is simply one data point. Forrester certainly has great data. They've put out a lot of things, but take this with a grain of salt because this is only representative of what they've built in terms of their data set. But you can see on this list, a lot of people are more aware of attacks. A lot of people are focusing on business partners and kind of the supply chain aspects. But then you also see on the list 2 areas that are directly related to this conversation, one of which is increasing the use of threat intel services and also building more team members and hiring more people that have this kind of skill set, security analysts and security intelligence people to start doing this kind of work. And I think that's another very telling aspect here. So, kind of stepping into the threat intel cycle and looking at what organizations can do here, really this kind of represents the big picture of how you go about starting this, right? Building your kind of plan, that goes into hiring people, maybe procuring services, looking at the collection of IOCs and processing those, going through the analysis stage, and then really the last 2 pieces here are kind of the dissemination piece, which is who gets this data once you've built threat intelligence, both internally and then potentially externally. And then the piece that isn't on that graph, this last piece, is how do you share it? Right? How can you securely disseminate this in a format that other people can immediately make use of? So all of this is kind of critical to consider, and kind of represents, I think, some areas for real improvement, which leads us naturally to one effort in this area, which is the Open Threat Exchange that you guys are doing over at Alien Vault. So Jaime, why don't you kind of explain what it is and give people an overview of what you guys are doing here?
Yeah, so OTX was an initiative that we launched last year to make easier to people to share information about threats that they are seeing. So I love using the term crowdsourced threat intelligence because basically you are building your threat intelligence not only based on the information that you see, but on the information that your peers are seeing. So our approach is open and collaborative because we don't believe that any vendor has the best security tools and all the answers to detect threats. So basically, thanks to our platform basically collects data from any single security device in your network and is vendor agnostic. So it can process data from IDS, from IPS, from antivirus solutions, from any single vendor. And the good thing is that we build this Open Threat Exchange platform that is basically a system that is collecting information from our open source users and commercial users that are willing to share that data. So that information is being sent to us, and our OTX system is processing that information, classifying the information, validating the information, and then generating more threat intelligence based on those indicators and other indicators that we are internally generating using our systems, our workers, and our manual analysis that my team is doing. And then we send back that threat intelligence to our open source users that are sharing that data and to our commercial users that are sharing that data. So in the end, you have this crowdsourced intelligence platform that is processing data from every single normalized event log that our system is able to process. So some examples are firewall data, content filters, intrusion prevention systems, intrusion detection systems, proxies, network devices, web servers, and so any single piece of information that can contain an IOC. So right now we are running this on more than 8,000 installations around the world and more than 140 different countries. We started this just sharing information about IP addresses that were being seen in different IDS signatures and different event logs from firewalls and so on. And we are extending these IOCs to domain names, to URLs, to malware samples. And when I'm saying malware samples, I mean every single IOC that can describe a behavior on a malware sample. So we are planning to extend all this platform to share all these different indicators in the next few months. And right now, just the good thing about this is that very easy to use. You just download our product. It can be the open source version or the trial version. You plug that into your network, and automatically you start sharing data and receiving data from all the other peers around the world. And that information is near real time. So as soon as a user in Japan that is running our system detect an exploit code in a web server in the US, that information is being sent in near real time. So you will have that information, and if your systems are able to detect activity going to that web server, the system will know that other users are seeing a threat in that web server in the US. And the fact is that even if you are not running the same technology that the other users are running, for instance, you are running a different intrusion prevention system from a different vendor, but the system is able to use those IOCs even if your vendor doesn't have a signature to detect that specific attack.
So thanks for that description, Jaime. And really, the thing is too, when you're building this kind of a program, using those kinds of tools and really kind of looking to gather additional data, I think one of the things that helps to start at least narrowing your focus, right, where you're going to start looking, especially internally, to gather indicators, is to basically just know what it is that you're protecting. And I know that sounds kind of flip. Yeah, let's make sure that we know exactly what it is we're protecting. But at the same time, a lot of people really don't. You can't just approach, especially if you're a big organization, you can't approach a threat intelligence program as this big kind of wide net that you just cast. You've got to start somewhere and start thinking about, not only the most sensitive data that people would want or that attackers would want, but who's got access to that data, and kind of follow that chain backwards so that, going to something like the kill chain concept that Jaime was talking about a minute ago, you can actually kind of post thoughts around what indicators you'd be looking for along the chain specific to that data and the people that are somewhat kind of surrounding it or accessing it on a regular basis. So this is kind of a starting point for most to really start getting their arms around this. The next thing you need to do is figure out your incident response capabilities and kind of glean what you currently have in terms of data types and determine whether you've been really building some of this without even realizing it. And in fact, working with a lot of SOC teams, I find that's the case, is that they're building good correlation rule sets, kind of like Jaime was talking about earlier with like do-it-yourself stuff from Snort and other sources. You may already have a lot of those things, and even if you're working with like managed security service providers that have done some of this work and built reports for you and things, you probably already have it as well. But what you really need to think is, well, if you spent the last 3 years monitoring your environment and looking for some sort of network-based indicators, for example, of behavioral patterns of traffic or specific suspicious block lists that you've developed, that can help kind of accelerate the pace of building a threat intelligence program fairly significantly. So you can definitely get some ideas from that as well. And so again, these are just ways to kind of get started as you're really thinking about this. Then moving along, you start looking at tools. So what kinds of tools do you currently have internally? Are they honeypots, logs, IDS, and IDS, IPS events? Vulnerability scanner data, local host tools, so whether it's things that are related to like the open IOC programs or things from vendors like Mandiant or from the folks that make Encase and building that kind of local forensics data. There's just an enormous number of different data types that candidly most people already have, and this is a different topic, certainly looking at wading through all that. But going into these types of tools, you probably have a lot that you can build from and start to offer both to internal teams and then again potentially out into that kind of crowdsourced model. So kind of taking all that data and doing something with it, I'll hand it back over to Jaime to kind of walk through and explain where that data goes and in your system in particular, how that really becomes the most useful.
Yeah, so the main, I think the most important thing here is if you already have all that data, you have to put all that data in the same place. So you can start running queries, you can start extracting other IOCs from that data, you can start correlating different pieces of information from different devices. And the most important thing is that the platform that we are using has to understand the meaning of those events and of that information that is coming from different vendors. So this is a screenshot of our system that basically you can send information about any device or any log source in your network, and how we categorize and how we aggregate that information in order to, if you're running two different IDS or two different IPS vendors in different parts of your network, in the end you need that the system that is aggregating and processing that information really knows that a different signature from a different vendor means the same. That's very important when you are performing this kind of data analysis and when you really want to extract IOCs and to describe behaviors from different actors and start building clusters of different activities based on different actors that are compromising your systems, or different actors that are in different stages of the kill chain. Another important thing here is, as I said, is that the platform that you are using has to contain different tools, so you can have a very good, at a glance view of the security state of all your assets. So the point here is that you're going to spend millions of dollars on different products from different vendors. So you can have an IDS from one vendor, you can have a HIDS from another vendor, you can have a security scanning, a vulnerability security scanning from a third vendor, you can have a forensic console from the first vendor that you have the IDS, but in the end that information is not aggregated anywhere. And you have to log in 5 different consoles to get all the information that you require to perform an incident response and to extract IOCs about an incident that you can use, that you can implement on your detection and prevention capabilities. So this is an example of our platform. Our platform is basically what we call unified security management, and what we are trying to solve is this problem that I mentioned before, that is, we don't have all the information in the same place. We spend millions of dollars on different vendors to receive different pieces of information that we are not able to centralize, and we are not able to extract value from. So what we are trying to solve is that problem, is having on the same platform any single security capability that you need in order to detect, to prevent, and to perform incident response activities in your network.
Oh, looks like we went too far there. Yep. So kind of building on what Jaime was talking about, really you can't have too much data, but you can have too much data, right? So the key is to have good diversity of data, and make sure that you're thinking about where the most valuable data might be. But sorting through and making sure that the data you are gathering and that you're making use of actually is important to you, right? So that you're not just gathering data for gathering's sake. You're actually doing something meaningful and making use of that data in important ways. And so that's why you have to start looking and saying, well, if we have all this data internally, and to Jaime's point, trying to start moving it towards putting it in a single location, I think that's important, because you've got to start making sense of the types of data that will in fact be most important, but you won't know that until you have it in one place and you can start kind of sifting through it and starting to look and see where it kind of fits into the different campaign structures that you're building. And I think this is a pretty decent example that again is kind of building from some of the kill chain concepts and really starting to look at the types of data that you might see. where you're looking at things like, headers or target access, looking at exploits that might be there or dropped files that have been left behind, looking at payloads in terms of network communications that are showing up, looking at malware, obviously, since that's a big part of a lot of these types of attacks, looking at download locations that are being accessed, so things like IP addresses or sources that potentially are known to be places where bad activity is going on, looking at human activity and so forth. So this is all the kinds of intelligence that you would really want to be putting together in more of a structured way, I think, to kind of start figuring out which data was going to be most valuable to you, and then building that to really make our own programs internally better, right? So trying to make sure that we're informing our proactive controls and not just building, kind of a defensive wall, but also looking to get better over time. And so this might mean, for example, improving, patch cycles, or improving change management windows, or looking at vulnerability scanning and kind of tailoring the types of scan data that we were getting and maybe the way that we were approaching that. So again, more towards not only just building threat intelligence, but building a more continuous improvement cycle within vulnerability management. And so these couple different pieces across, assessment, mitigation, and then monitoring and reporting all have some tie-ins to your threat intel program. And really what it comes down to is building things like system and environment baselines, and also just really making sure that you're improving your level of policy enforcement as you go, right? Not just saying, well, now we know what's going on in the environment, but we're also really trying to get better at enforcing things, and again, whether that's configuration or whether that's patching or whether that's scanning, all of those things can really be informed by going out and looking for the indicators of potential compromise. So I'll turn it back over to Jaime to kind of walk through the ways that the collaborative approach can kind of help with that.
Yeah, so as a summary of what we previously said about this crowdsourced intelligence idea that we had, is that basically you have to build your threat intelligence not only from your peers, but also from a diverse installed base in different industries, in different locations, different industries, different company sizes. Because in the end, I mean, we live in a world where most of the attackers are compromising different kind of industries and different sizes and different companies in different industries at the same time. Of course, we have, especially in targeted attacks, we have all these groups of attackers that are very focused on specific industries, but it's not like that always. I mean, we have seen groups of attackers targeting a very wide range of different industries. So all these initiatives that are right now where you can share threat intelligence with your peers on your same industry are good and are helpful. But once again, if you can share and you can receive information from different industries, and the more diverse the data is, the most valuable the threat intelligence is. And then once again, to describe OTX, so some summary statistics about our crowdsourced OTX program is that we are analyzing the order of 500,000 samples per day. We are receiving more than 100,000 malicious IPs from our peers, and we are receiving information from more than 8,000 different endpoints, global connection points around the world, and in more than 140 different countries. And as I said before, all this raw information that we receive is being analyzed by automated systems that are basically built to make sure that this information is accurate, and we are applying algorithms like the information has to be seen by different users, by a number of users in different parts of the world, depending on the activity that we are seeing, and so on. So we are running different algorithms in order to certify that information is accurate enough.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a ton of information actually. So very cool stuff. That basically wraps us up. So I mean, the reality is, everybody realizes the need for this today. We've seen this really kind of emerge. It's simply a matter of figuring out how we can start working together better. And I think taking that wisdom of crowds approach, where all of us are gathering all this data from internal tools and sources, starting to correlate it, building better indicators, starting to look at things like kill chains and kind of more focused timeline-based approaches for campaigns. The question is, if everybody does that on their own, how can we all benefit, right? How can we start sharing some of that and really putting together a bigger picture where again, the wisdom of crowds kind of emerges. So I think OTX is a pretty cool effort that's actually trying to accomplish that exact purpose. So we do have just a minute or two left here. If anybody has any kind of final questions here, and I think one actually did come in. And so I see this question in here. I'll just go ahead and ask this. And it said, on slide 20, how much space is needed to host all that data, and would the cloud be an option? Jaime, why don't you take a shot at that, since you guys have been building so much, kind of these large data sets.
Say that again?
How much space is needed to host all this data, and would the cloud actually be an option? So that was referring to slide 20, and I'm just going back there now to kind of bring that up. When you're talking about all these different types of data that are being gathered and that are being correlated, what are you guys seeing in terms of storage needs and so forth?
So of course it highly depends on the size of your company, but I think the most, if you want to start building this threat intelligence program, the first thing that you have to do is collect as much information as you can, and then trying to make sense of that information. And then once you know which pieces of information are really valuable, so you can start filtering that information and just storing and receiving information that can really help you building IOCs and using IOCs to detect attacks on those pieces of information. But of course, you don't want to save all the log sources from all the devices in your company, just those that really can give you security information.
Yeah, I would agree. And so just by way of example, I've actually got a few clients that are doing some of this internally, and they're actually seeing in the neighborhood of, some of these guys are seeing like a terabyte a day, or even more than that. And so you can certainly run into really, really large storage scenarios. I think you've got to be very careful about storing things in the cloud, not only because of the sensitivity of the data. I think that's probably the paramount idea, but also the accessibility of that data and the usability of that data for correlation purposes and so forth. So I think there's kind of mixed blessings there. I think we're figuring that out, and certainly we're starting to look at better and newer ways to use the cloud for storage purposes, but I don't know that that's probably going to be the primary way people are doing this, at least in the very foreseeable future, as they start sharing this kind of intelligence data, at least from my experience.
It looks like we're just about out of questions here. Dave, Jaime, did you guys have any maybe final statements or closing remarks?
So just to add something else to what David said, in the end was that it's not about quantity, it's about quality. When we are talking about threat intelligence, if you really can have a subset of indicators that are really helping you to be ahead of different group of attackers, is much more valuable than having a huge collection of IOCs that you are not able to handle and that you are not able to implement in your security program. So that for me is more important.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think people are figuring that out too, right? Despite what the big data industry tells you, just having more data doesn't always translate to building better threat intel by any means.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'd like to send out a special thanks to Dave and Hamey for bringing this content to the SANS community. Your presentation was great. We'd also like to thank Alient for sponsoring this webcast.